beautiful cumulus clouds. It is the ravishing beauty of the mountains. It is the gorgeous sound of the music. It is the delight of the children.
We all think we know the sound of music inside and out. The hills, the twirling, the singing nun, who somehow always sounds pitch perfect. It feels like one of those movies that came together effortlessly. Like the camera just happened to be there at the right moment every single time. But here's the truth. Nothing about this film was effortless. Buried inside this beloved classic are mistakes that were never fixed, moments that were never res hot, and details that slipped past editors who were racing against a ticking clock and a shrinking budget. Once you know where to look, you'll never watch this movie the same way again. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll be itching to rewatch your favorite scenes just to catch these hidden slip-ups for yourself. Let's start with the single most famous image in the entire film, Maria spinning in an open meadow, arms wide, belting out the title song as the mountains rise behind her. It's the shot that opens the movie and the one most people picture when they think of The Sound of Music. What audiences never realize is how brutal that shot was to actually capture. The production wanted a sweeping, cinematic aerial approach, so the crew strapped a camera operator to a helicopter and had the aircraft fly directly at Julie Andrews as she spun in the grass. This was still a fairly experimental filming technique for the era, and it came with serious problems. Helicopters are deafening up close, and Andrews genuinely couldn't hear her cues over the noise. The solution was almost comically low-tech. A choreographer hid in the nearby bushes with a megaphone, shouting timing cues at her over the roar of the rotor blades. Even when the timing worked, the helicopter's downdraft was so strong it repeatedly knocked Andrews off her feet, sending her tumbling into the grass. She needed roughly half a dozen attempts before the crew got a take usable enough for the final cut. And the challenges didn't stop with the aircraft. The farmer who owned the field had agreed to leave his grass stall for filming, but by the time the crew returned to shoot, it had already been cut short. The production team had to scramble, bringing in extra greenery, rerouting a small stream, and even relocating trees to recreate the lush look they needed. The farmer, understandably frustrated by the disruption to his land and cattle, grew less and less cooperative as filming dragged on. Somehow, out of all that chaos, one of the most iconic single shots in movie history was born. Behind the polish of this film were real injuries, and one in particular stands out. During the filming of 16 going on 17, the flirtatious duet performed inside a glass wall gazebo. Actress Charmian Carr, who played the eldest Von Trapp daughter, Liesel, slipped on the floor near the end of a take. She lost her footing and crashed straight through a glass panel, injuring her ankle badly enough that it needed to be bandaged on the spot. Rather than pause production, the crew made a quick decision: patch her up, cover the injury with makeup, and adjust her blocking so the pain wouldn't show on camera. The scene was completed that same day. It's a small miracle that nothing about her performance hints at the accident at all. As for the gazebo itself, the real structure in Salzburg turned out to be too cramped for the camera equipment and crew to work inside comfortably. So the production built a larger, more filmable replica back on the studio lot in Los Angeles. Julie Andrews left her own mark on the film in a much gentler way. At the tail end of Do Re Mi, she reaches for a note that wasn't written into the original score, pushing her voice up an octave simply because she felt like she could. It became one of the most recognizable flourishes in the entire soundtrack, which makes it even more bittersweet that Andrews would later lose much of her upper vocal range following a throat surgery decades after the film was made. Not every film scene made it to theaters, either. Several sequences were shot and later removed entirely, including a moment where Liesel formally introduces Rolf to her family, and a solo rendition of Edelweiss performed by the captain out in the garden. Director Robert Wise trimmed these scenes because he felt they slowed the story's momentum, favoring a tighter pace over completeness. Whether or not you agree with those choices, they show just how much shaping happened after the cameras stopped rolling. It's strange to think about now, but The Sound of Music wasn't an instant, guaranteed hit when it hit theaters in 1965. Critical reviews at the time were mixed, with some writers dismissing it as sentimental or old-fashioned at a moment when Hollywood was starting to lean into edgier, more cynical storytelling. Audiences, however, disagreed almost immediately. Within about a month of its release, the film had climbed to the top of the box office and simply refused to budge. By the following year, it had overtaken Gone with the Wind to become the highest-grossing film of all time, a title it would hold onto for roughly 5 years. Over its theatrical life, including 2 major re-releases, the film sold hundreds of millions of tickets around the world and pulled in staggering box office numbers for a musical, breaking records across dozens of countries. In some cities, theaters kept it running continuously for years at a stretch. Part of what made it endure wasn't just the scenery or the songs, though both certainly helped. It was how emotionally direct the story was. It combined romance, family, and quiet moral courage into something that felt universally understandable, anchored by a magnetic lead performance from Andrews. Families returned to see it again and again, turning individual screenings into shared community events where people would leave the theater humming the songs and bring friends back for a second or third viewing. The film became something bigger than a movie. It became a cultural touchstone, drawing tourists to Salzburg for decades afterward and turning its imagery into shorthand for hope and resilience. Today it feels unthinkable to picture anyone but Julie Andrews as Maria, but landing her in the role wasn't a sure thing. Screenwriter Ernest Lehman was convinced early on that she was the only real choice, reportedly insisting there was simply no one else who could play the part. The problem was that in 1964, Andrews wasn't yet the star we remember. Her 2 most notable film projects, Mary Poppins and The Americanization of Emily, hadn't even been released yet, and most of Hollywood still thought of her primarily as a stage performer. Studio executives weren't fully convinced either. She had already been passed over for the film version of My Fair Lady, a role she originated on Broadway, with one studio head reportedly deciding she wasn't suited for the camera. Instead, executives floated a long list of established names for Maria, including several major actresses of the era, and one future star even auditioned multiple times for a younger role in the film. Any one of those alternate choices could have completely changed how this story is remembered today. What tipped the scales in Andrews' favor was director Robert Wise getting an early look at unreleased footage from Mary Poppins. He recognized her star power immediately and moved quickly to secure her for the part before another studio could scoop her up. She ultimately signed for a modest fee with no share of future profits, a deal that looks almost quaint considering how quickly her asking price would skyrocket afterward. Interestingly, Andrews herself was wary of the material going in. Her first question to Wise was reportedly about how they planned to keep the story from becoming overly sentimental. That instinct mattered. Her grounded, slightly wry performance is a big part of why the film reads as sincere rather than syrupy. While Andrews was locked in relatively early, finding the right Captain Von Trapp took much longer and came with far more resistance. Christopher Plummer, who eventually took the role, nearly turned it down more than once. On paper, he found the character flat and one-note, later describing an early version of the part as little more than a stiff, humorless authority figure. Several other major leading men of the time were considered before Plummer, but none of them felt like quite the right fit. Plummer only agreed to sign on after pushing back directly on the material. He wrote to the screenwriter outlining exactly what he wanted changed. More wit, more warmth, more contradiction. He wanted audiences to see the captain's guarded heart slowly thaw because of Maria's influence, not because the script simply told them it happened. He also asked for scenes that let him play multiple sides of the character, cold and controlled in one moment, unexpectedly tender in the next. The production took his notes seriously, reshaping key scenes to give the role more depth. Plummer later admitted that those revisions were what finally convinced him to commit fully to the part. He even pushed for a solo musical moment to give the captain more emotional interiority, though not every idea he proposed made the final cut. What we're left with is a performance that feels layered rather than stereotypical, precisely because the actor playing him refused to settle for less. The postcard-perfect scenery audiences see on screen hides a much Messier production reality. Filming in and around Salzburg meant contending with near-constant rain, which repeatedly halted shooting and forced the crew to work in short bursts between downpours. What looks like a sunny, uninterrupted afternoon on camera was often stitched together from scattered minutes of usable daylight. Christopher Plummer was already dealing with his own frustrations during this stretch, unhappy that portions of his singing would be dubbed by another vocalist, and the unpredictable weather only added to the tension on set. One sequence in particular, Liesl climbing back through Maria's window after her evening with Rolf, required more than a dozen takes because of lighting inconsistencies, continuity problems, and the rain itself. To simulate a soaked, rain-drenched look for close-ups, the crew used a rain machine on set that left actress Charmian Carr cold and shivering between takes. Even getting equipment into position became a battle. Muddy roads in the mountains made it impossible to drive vehicles up certain hills, so cast and crew, including Julie Andrews herself, had to be transported by ox cart instead. Director Robert Wise later remembered seeing Andrews bundled in a heavy coat, riding in one of those carts, patiently waiting to shoot what would become one of the film's most iconic opening images. Delays like these piled up costs and stretched everyone's patience thin, including during a much-loved sequence where the children jump on Maria's bed while singing My Favorite Things, which had to be postponed multiple times because of the weather. And yet somehow, none of that visible strain made it into the final print. On screen, Salzburg looks eternally sunny. If there's one moment that should have been simple to film, it's the romantic kiss between Maria and the captain late in the story. Instead, it turned into one of the most chaotic sequences of the entire shoot. The crew relied on large arc lights to create a soft, moonlit glow for the scene, but the lights had an unfortunate side effect. They emitted a strange groaning noise every time they powered up, something actors on set compared to an odd raspberry sound. Every time Andrews and Plummer leaned in to kiss, that noise would ring out across the set, and both actors would immediately dissolve into laughter. No matter how many times they reset, they couldn't hold a straight face through the sound. Andrews later admitted in retrospective interviews that she and Plummer simply couldn't stop giggling once the lights kicked in. Robert Wise, very aware that every failed take was costing the production money, eventually solved the problem by having the moment shot in near darkness, which conveniently hid both the noise's disruption and the actors' barely contained laughter. The final, romantic-looking kiss audiences see on screen took roughly a dozen attempts and represents hours of suppressed giggling stitched into something that reads as effortlessly tender. One of the more light-hearted-looking scenes in the film, Maria and the children tumbling out of a rowboat into a lake, was actually one of the more dangerous ones to shoot. The sequence required several takes of the boat capsizing, each one meant to look spontaneous while still being tightly controlled. The real danger came from the fact that Kim Carruth, the young actress playing the youngest Von Trapp child, couldn't swim. The plan called for Andrews to fall forward into the water so she'd land near Carruth and immediately help her to safety. During filming, though, Andrews ended up falling backward instead, away from the young actress, leaving Carruth briefly struggling in the water before crew members rushed in to help. In the finished film, you can actually spot another young cast member helping pull Carruth out of the lake in the background. Andrews later spoke about how shaken she was by the moment, while praising Carruth's composure under pressure. The lake itself was uncomfortably cold, and the children's costumes became waterlogged and heavy, making every take more exhausting than the last. Safety personnel were stationed nearby throughout filming, but it's a reminder that even the most playful-looking scenes sometimes carried real risk for young performers. Once you start looking closely, this film is full of tiny continuity errors that somehow survived the editing process. During Liesl's rainy return through Maria's bedroom window, her position on the bed noticeably shifts between camera angles in ways that don't match up. Captain Von Trapp has his own share of inconsistencies. In one scene, an object he's holding switches hands between shots with no time for that to have realistically happened. There are also a handful of moments where a child actor can be caught still mouthing song lyrics after the music has technically ended. A small, human detail that never got trimmed out. And in one especially fun anachronism, a brief shot of the family's getaway car reveals a tire tread style that historians have pointed out wasn't actually manufactured until years after the story is supposed to take place. None of these details are dramatic, and most viewers will never notice them without pausing and rewinding. But they're proof that even a film remembered as flawless was built by real people working under real pressure, making real, human mistakes along the way. Here's the thing about all of these slip-ups, injuries, and near disasters. They don't take anything away from why this film has endured for 6 decades. If anything, they make it more impressive. Every spinning shot, every duet, every glance between Maria and the captain was the product of exhausted, soaked, occasionally injured people fighting weather, equipment, and their own laughter to get something beautiful on film. The mistakes are proof of the effort, not evidence against it. So the next time you watch The Sound of Music, keep an eye out for these small imperfections. They won't ruin the magic. If anything, they'll remind you that the magic was built by hand,